And we want to turn to COP26 coming up this weekend. Obviously, it is another, I don't know if it is an inflection point, but it's another opportunity for us to reflect on the climate catastrophe that is sadly right with us now. I mean, we cannot talk about it being something in the future. I mean, this is right now. Very happy to be joined again here by Brandon Wu, who is the Director of Policy and Campaigns at ActionAid USA. Brandon, thanks so much for coming back with us.
Thanks for having me again.
Well, here we go again. The pleasure is all ours. But it really is. Brandon, going into this weekend, obviously the two things are working together or not working together with Congress and COP26 coming up. And if anything, I think it's just reminding us how much needs to be done and how little is being done in so many key areas. And one of the things I wanted to start with here is, how what's happening in Congress is going to be presented by the U.S. delegation. I mean, there's a lot of conversation that they're rushing to try to finish something to be able to announce it by the debut of COP26. But, you had a great piece recently about climate finance in particular, but I think sort of bringing into focus the scale of what needs to happen. How are you evaluating the at least potential climate measures in the budget reconciliation bill? And how does that measure up to, where we should be in terms of the U.S.'s fair share in this?
Yeah, this is, I gotta say, this is a hard moment for me. What I am used to doing, what my organization is used to doing is saying, look, we can't just look at what's politically possible. We have to look at what science and equity demand. We have to look at what the U.S. fair share of climate action is globally, given our massive historical emissions, given the national wealth that we've built by destroying the climate and the environment. And that fair share is enormous. So we actually calculated that a few months ago and came up with a figure that the U.S. has to do the equivalent of reducing its emissions by 195% by 2030 from 2005 levels. And that means, what we were saying was that can be done through 70% domestic reductions. And then the rest of it has to be finance and technological support for developing countries to reduce their own emissions. We have to do both of those things. They go hand in hand. Without both, we cannot solve the climate crisis. Now, on the other hand, we've got what's going on in Congress and what's going on with the Build Back Better agenda and how that, the original agenda was already not big enough, and it's only gotten watered down as the Democrats negotiate with themselves, as you've already talked about. And what we have left is, frankly, pathetic compared to the need. On the other hand, and this is where it gets hard, I think, when's the next time that we can actually pass anything, right? Because the Democrats are shooting themselves in the foot. They're probably going to lose in the midterms. We're going to get a bunch of climate deniers in our government again. So, do we wait another 10 years until we have another Democratic trifecta that's probably going to be just as ineffective? Do we hold out hope for an insurgent third party movement? In a different conversation, like those are valid arguments, but we're talking about a climate crisis where it's already too late and we have to act with as much urgency as possible right now. And so we're left with this picture where we kind of have to push for whatever we think we can get right now in this moment without foreclosing the possibility of doing better in the future. And that, frankly, is a pretty hard place to be. So what we're saying about the COP is that whatever the U.S. is coming to the table with is pathetically insufficient. There's just no way. Like, our politics are not in the right place. Everything is too dominated by the fossil fuel industry still. And we've got a long way to go. If, though, the Biden administration, says, if, say, they were able to pass the whole Build Back Better package, the original 3.5 trillion or whatever, even that wasn't going to be enough. But we could have said, look, this is a signal to the rest of the world that we're actually taking this seriously, right? And we know that this is not good enough, but we're going to be fighting. And this is sort of a first step. If, on the other hand, what the Biden administration wants to do now, right, is force a vote on the bipartisan infrastructure package, which is this pathetic, even more watered down thing, right? And they're trying to use the COP as an excuse, saying we need to pass this bipartisan package so that we can bring something to Glasgow. The world is going to laugh at that, right? If that's what happens, they're going to say this isn't even an honest attempt, right, to be serious about the problem. You can't tell us this is the climate bill. That's pathetic, right? Um, so we'll see. I
Yeah.
mean, whatever the U.S. does, it's not going to be enough. We already know that. But there are ways that it could signal that we're actually serious, and ways that it could signal that we're the same old sort of imperialist power that's not living up to our responsibility to the rest of the world.
No, I think that couldn't be very well said, and I think that this is really just an extraordinarily tough moment. And I think this is in many ways why we've seen the level of urgency increase amongst those who are on the ground and organizing, because we have to, I think, push that level of urgency. Which brings me to my next question. And I know, I mean, for years, maybe it's not even much of a question now, but I mean, I know for years one of the big challenges in talking around climate issues is people said, well, look, you don't want to say it's going to be too bad, because then people are going to be demoralized, they're going to be worried, and all these other pieces. But I mean, it seems to me that we can't avoid this now, even though it sounds catastrophic, because it is catastrophic. I mean, I was doing some research earlier this week on what would happen with the report coming out, or I don't know if it was a report, but the article by Brad Plumer talking about how the Earth is on track for 3 degrees of warming by the end of the century. And I couldn't even find that much information about how bad that was, because it was so bad. There are so many scientists and others that are like, we don't even know if we can predict what's going to happen when we get to this level. And even I, who, I feel like I'm attuned to these issues, I was kind of taken aback by that. I was like, wow, this is even worse than I thought. So, I mean, maybe it's not much of a question at this point because it's so serious, but it does seem that now sort of making it clear what the consequences are is maybe a more important fight than it has been even in the past.
Yeah, and I think that is getting easier as we're seeing more and more and worse climate disasters and climate impacts. I think the line that we have to walk, as you said, is how do we communicate that without being disempowering, right? There was a fad in journalism. It was actually a few years ago, which was this sort of climate apocalypse story, about how it's too late, we're screwed, no matter what we do now, especially given our current global politics, they're like, we don't have a chance of solving this problem, and so we might as well dig in for the long haul, whatever that means. And a colleague of mine wrote what I think is a sort of evergreen piece. I don't know. Can I curse on this show?
Yes, you can.
Which
This is YouTube.
which was just he just called it "fuck your apocalypse."
Mm,
Um, and his point was, if we give up, right, then we are giving up on frontline communities. We're giving up on the people who are most vulnerable to this crisis, who had nothing to do with it. And it is, in fact, a position of massive privilege to be able to say, we should just give up and live with the consequences of global climate change. That's not what our colleagues in the global south are doing. That's not what frontline communities are doing. They are fighting even in the face of, like, you know, incredibly adverse odds and conditions. And to say this is just hopeless, there's nothing we can do, is actually a massive statement of privilege. And so I think we can hold these things, both of these things at once, right? The crisis is really bad. We're too late to avoid some of its worst impacts, but we can still fight. We can still try to make things better. We can still push for the revolution that we need. And in fact, the conditions for that, hopefully the conditions for that becoming more likely will change as things get worse. We don't know, but that won't happen if we stop fighting, right?
yeah. No, I think that's a good point. And to some degree, we've already at least seen that incipiently. I mean, not just with the organizing here, but, I think we don't talk about it enough like this. I'll give Christian Parenti some credit for pointing this out to me a couple years ago. But I mean, you look at Sudan and what happened in 2019. I mean, a lot of what's happening there is that people are being forced off their land because they can't grow food. They're going close to the Nile River. I know there's a lot going on there now, and we'll maybe talk about that later in the show, but millions of people took to the streets, took their own sort of lives into their own hands. Egypt, obviously, probably, at least in my opinion, didn't go exactly the way, but similar thing, climate change effects and people coming out. And I think we're seeing, whether we're talking about Minnesota, whether we're talking about Africa, whether we're talking about Latin America, that even when it's sort of a slightly delayed reaction, like people might not be saying we're doing this because of climate change, the sort of deeper conditions it's nested in, we are seeing sort of a new insurgent energy that I think has come from the consequences of this. And I don't want to say it's a silver lining or be too hopeful about it, but I do think that it is something that people can sink their teeth into, Brandon, in terms of what's possible.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's also a lot of dangers, with what you were just talking about, and with Christian Parenti's work. It makes me think about climate-induced migration, which is an issue that a lot of the activist community is starting to pay more attention to. That's going to be a massive phenomenon in the coming decades, right? We know that all the research is telling us that the estimates of the numbers of people displaced range wildly from tens of millions to like literally a billion, right? Just no one knows. But it's going to be huge, and we have to be ready for that, and we have to be ready with a response that is not xenophobic, that is not national security based, that is not eco-fascist, right? Because that's going to be the default, especially I think Europe is already a sort of cautionary tale of this, and obviously we see a lot of those trends in the United States already. But I can't remember if I said this on your show last week, but we have to be prepared with a sort of narrative of shared humanity, and that we're all in this together, and that we have to tackle this problem through global solidarity, rather than through some nationalistic exercise where we're militarizing our borders in response to the climate crisis.
And it really is, that narrative that you're talking about, that sort of like that narrative fight, where you have the sort of eco-fascist ideas versus basically like just like what you talked about, a common humanity, is so important right now, because you also have these big like philanthropic foundations run by people like Bill Gates and others, who are really just like buying up real estate around the world, pushing these crazy ideas that, when you think about it, what they're actually talking about, like they talk about population control. They don't really say it like that, but that's kind of what they mean. They talk about this thing called half Earth. There's really nasty ideas by like our sort of like billionaire overlord class about how to deal with climate change. And it really is to just ramp up imperialism, to just create this really parasitic situation that already exists to a more extreme degree, where you have these rich global north countries that seem to really still think that they'll be insulated from the worst impacts of climate change, because maybe they don't think they're being impacted as much, or that they can insulate themselves with like better infrastructure. But that they can just like a huge part of humanity in the global south will just have to live with the consequences behind these big walls. And we'll just continue to prosper. And I mean, it's just a joke that they think that that's how we can live, but also it's really dangerous, because people do fall for this. And also, you guys were talking about that earlier, like the fact that there is this narrative, especially it remains a narrative, I think, in the corporate media. And I don't think it's accidental, this idea that we can't do anything to change it. It's done. You have to accept that there's going to be catastrophic climate change. And that too is really beneficial for the ruling class, because what better than to have people just accept it and not do anything to push back, right? So how do we deal with that challenge? How do we deal with that challenge of apathy? Because when it comes to this issue, it does seem like, when you look around, of course, there's incredible organizing taking place, and I don't want to take away from that, but there also is this kind of people just, shrugging their shoulders and saying, well, the media told me there's nothing I can do about it.
Yeah, so I mean, two things. I think what you said about apathy actually goes hand in hand with the solutions that the billionaires are offering us, because people are like, oh, we can't change society, like that's crazy. But maybe these billionaires have some techno fix, right? Maybe there's some scientific discovery that we'll come up with, or some geoengineering technique, so that we can actually just fix this problem without upending the status quo, right? That's what the billionaires want. That's what all their money is driving towards. And so the apathy serves that agenda, right? And I think to counter that apathy, I mean, it's a failure of imagination, right?
Mm.
Um, a few years ago, I was doing some work on renewable energy in the global south, and um, for so many people, the vision of a transition to a renewable energy economy looks a whole hell of a lot like our existing energy economy, except the big corporations are running centralized solar plants instead of coal-fired power plants, right? And that's not how it needs to be, right? That's not how it should be. Like the nature of solar energy is that it can be and should be controlled by everyone, right? And so we were pushing this model of decentralized, community controlled renewable energy. And it was like mind blowing for some people because they're like, oh, you mean the transition isn't just swapping out one technology for another? It's like a whole different way of structuring power and structuring control. Yeah, but that's not how we are used to thinking, right? And so there's this thing about transforming people's imagination so that we can imagine what's possible that we're just, I just think we're not good at as a society. And I think one of the most effective interventions from a few years ago was actually that video from Alexandria Ocasio Cortez, where it was like, imagine a future, right? And it's like that sort of exercise um, that we need more of. It's not enough on its own, obviously. But I think that's got to be a starting point because right now, people are so limited by what they think is possible that we can't even have the kinds of conversations we need to be having.
No, I think that's such a good point. I was thinking about this morning, checking in on the South African election, where I don't know how many people are paying attention to that, but one of the biggest issues by far is electricity. The power was out today, and it's worse now because they say they're going to keep the power on all day during election days, so they're doing whatever they can. But it's I don't want to make too many wild commentaries on the political parties of South Africa. I don't live there, but I mean, it is just stunning to me the sort of lack of. They say, well, there's nothing we can really do about it. It is what it is. The infrastructure, the power lines. It's going to take us 35 years to fix it. While at the same time, they're saying how everyone, many people, even in the shanty towns, are having to get solar panels just to survive. And there's no rethinking of or thoughts of rethinking the grid, rethinking spatial orientation. And when you think like that, then yeah, there really is nothing you can do, and people are in fact condemned to live in the dark. But that's just such a defeative statement on so many levels. But it does bring me to another point that we've also sort of been sort of glancing on here that I think is important, Brandon, and that is the impacts on the global South. I mean, I think that maybe people hear a lot about it, but really when we look at sort of historic emissions, people who were really paying for a problem that they, by and large, did not cause, and then who are now being told, well, listen, you can't have any of the good things we have because your carbon footprint will go up. I mean, it does seem that there is sort of like a reparatory justice element to this conversation as well.
Yeah, and frankly, that's why the COP and the UN climate negotiations is important. It's really the only space to have those kinds of conversations in a space that is at least formally democratic. Now, obviously, there's geopolitics at play. There's dirty tricks that wealthy countries play behind closed doors all the time, but it's a formally democratic space, and developing countries can raise those kinds of concerns, questions about reparations, even if they don't use that language. The language is loss and damage in the UN negotiations. And those are big demands. A big priority for developing countries at this year's negotiations is loss and damage finance. We've set up these sort of kind of centers to think about loss and damage and how climate impacts are affecting developing countries and how they can be supported in dealing with those. And there's no money attached to any of that. So now they're saying, look, we need a financial mechanism for this. We need to be able to access resources to deal with loss and damage from climate impacts when we had nothing to do with causing the problem. So not surprisingly, the US and other wealthy countries don't really want to talk about it. It was a fight just to get that on the agenda. And the balance of forces is very much against having an outcome that is favorable for developing countries. But we got to fight, right? That's what that space is supposed to be for, and we need to we can't cede it. I will say that one thing I want to get ahead of in the narrative at these negotiations, really at all climate negotiations, is U.S.-China kind of stuff, right? China just today announced its new nationally determined contribution or sort of climate action plan that it submits to the UN. China is always the scapegoat in the U.S. We like to say China's not doing enough, and so in order to be competitive in the global economy, we can't go beyond what China is willing to do. Well, according to our analysis, China is actually roughly doing its fair share of climate action, right? Using that same analysis that I mentioned earlier in the show. That's not to say that more isn't needed from China. China is currently a very large emitter, although a lot of those emissions are embedded in the production of goods for the Western world. And China also has a massive, development and poverty alleviation problem still. So they've got a ways to go, but they're roughly doing their fair share, according to our analysis, relative to, say, the United States, which is pledging 4 or 5 times less than what we need to be doing. And so, I just want to make sure, I know you've talked about this on your show before, but it's just too easy for US politicians to go after China as a scapegoat. And the picture is significantly more complicated than that. And even when we managed to come up with a bilateral deal with China, like before we negotiated the Paris Agreement, the Obama administration did a lot of outreach to China and announced this US-China bilateral deal. And then all of a sudden we started scapegoating India, right? We're saying, oh, look at this other country that has a whole lot of people and is emitting a lot, right? I mean, it's just absurd. There's so many ways for US politicians to try to deflect blame. And we got to call that out for what it is.
Yeah, no, and I really appreciate you making that point. I think it was the Friends of the Earth letter about this issue that I thought phrased it very well, that, well, I'm actually using my own phrasing, but sort of paraphrasing. This is really an era of global cooperation, and that on pretty much all the challenges facing us, of course, starting with climate, if we're not thinking about how we have shared frameworks and shared points of reference about how we move forward on this, it's all just sort of, whistling Dixie as we walk down the street. I mean, it really is, it's where we are in the 21st century, and I hope people, can grasp that. Well, Brandon, as always, I really appreciate you joining us here on the show. Appreciate all the work you guys are doing at ActionAid USA. Definitely, I hope people check in and plug into the work that y'all are doing. And we'll just keep coming back to this because, as you said very correctly, we got to fight. So I will say the pleasure was all ours. Thanks for having back with us.
Mine too. Thank you.
Second week in a row.